Hey everybody, it's Matt from the house, and in this video we're going to show you some common damage that happens to your snowboard that you can actually fix yourself in the convenience of your own home. Let's check this out. Okay, so in this video, we're gonna pay attention a little bit more towards the sides of your boards and the sidewalls. Obviously when you're out riding around, especially when you start hitting rails and things like that, or even if you're getting into the trees, a lot of times the side of your board can bash into things. And, a lot of times you'll get little dents and things in your sidewall, not a huge deal. The one thing that you would definitely wanna look at if you do hit something is you wanna look at the side of your board and you're looking for separation basically between the sidewall and the top sheet or the sidewall and the edge. A lot of times it's going to be between the sidewall and the edge. Like on this board, we literally have got, you can tell that it definitely ran into something, and there's a little bit of a gap in between. You can actually see the edge of the board, the fiberglass, and then there's some separation between that and the sidewall. And that's basically the thing that you definitely want to get fixed as quickly as possible, just because, again, water gets inside there, it can actually cause your board to delaminate. So you can kind of stick the razor blade in there and we can kind of pry it a little bit and kind of see, you can actually see exactly where the dent is on the board, on the sidewall there. And what we want to do is we want to clean that thing up before we put any epoxy in there. Another thing that we look at too is that if you hit something really, really hard, you'll actually get this bump on the base of the board. That's basically where the edge has pushed up the base of the board too. And that's something that, depending on how big that is, if it's really, really big, you might want to take it to your local ski shop to have them, fix that for you. If it's a little small one, you can kind of pound it out a little bit with a hammer. Okay, so if you do have that little bump on there and we do want to pound that out with a hammer, it's a pretty easy thing to do. You're probably going to take your bindings off of your board, and then if you don't want to scratch up the, whatever table you have it on or the board, you can get yourself like an old t-shirt or a towel just to, protect it a little bit. You don't want anything too thick, because when you're hitting it with the hammer, you don't want a lot of cushion under there. It's basically not going to allow the the hammer to do its work. So, but you can kind of, again, put that t-shirt under there. Make sure that you've got the board on a flat surface too, where the kick, you can actually see the kicks are hanging off the sides of this table. We want that board, especially where we're going to be pounding on it, we want that to be as flat as possible. And then from there, it's exactly what it sounds like. You got to take the hammer and we're basically just going to try to pound it down and try to push it back down, a little bit, and try to flatten out that side of that edge. So. And you basically just come straight down on it and just pound right on that bump and kind of move along the bump a little bit there too. All right, well, we got this thing pounded out. You can still feel a little bit of a bump there, but it's not as bad as it was. If you are worried as to exactly how much it's bumping up, then again, I'd say take it to your local shop and have them repair it. Anytime you're not sure about something, like I said, always take it to a shop to have a ski tech who's certified and does this kind of stuff for a living to fix it. But again, we got that thing pounded out, and again, it's pretty flat. It's not perfect, but nothing ever is after you damage it, unless again you take it to that certified tech. All right, when you're getting ready to glue it, as always, we always want to make sure that the area that you are cleaning is clear and clean of any dirt and stuff. We don't want that mixing in. So right off the bat, again, I always just kind of wipe it down with a little bit of Windex. You could use a little bit of base cleaner if you want, but no, it doesn't have to be anything too crazy. And then also too, we want to take that razor blade and try to clean up any of these little areas on the side here. If you got pieces sticking out, like this one, we got a little piece sticking out right there. We're actually going to slide the razor right along the edge to kind of clean that up. All right, once you got that all cleaned up, you obviously want to make sure that you don't have any dirt and debris down inside, and you can use a razor blade to get that. This one actually looks pretty clean, so we're not going to dig in there too much. The only thing that I might do on this one is actually try to clean up, just stick it in there and kind of slice along a little bit, very, very carefully, just because the sidewall itself actually did get pushed into the edge. And when we hammered it down from the bottom, that did help actually compress it a little bit. But again, we don't want to make any more bump. So on this one, we've got that little extra piece of sidewall that has a dent where that material actually got pushed down towards the base, and we want to try to get that out of there too. Okay, now that we got that all cleaned up, next stop is to apply some epoxy. So we're gonna grab our 2-part epoxy. We're gonna grab, I got a piece of cardboard here, or you can use a little cup to mix it. I always like to take the cardboard too, if you use the cardboard, and kind of give it a little fold. That way you can actually flatten it out to kind of keep the epoxy nice and flat and easy to mix, but then you can kind of fold it up a little bit so it wants to all, kind of come down towards a lower point on the cardboard. Just makes it a little bit easier to mix it up. And then we're gonna grab our mixing stick, and we're also going to grab our plastic cellophane. So when we clamp it down, that way the clamps aren't going to stick to the cellophane. So just like we always do with epoxy, you want to squeeze it out. I always put my thumb on both tubes and make sure we get a equal amount of the hardener and the epoxy all together. And we're going to mix it up. All right, so like I was saying, I basically like to flatten it out to kind of bring all the epoxy together. And then while you're mixing it, you can kind of fold it up a little bit and kind of push everything down towards that little bit of that valley. I just find it makes it a little bit easier to mix it and keep the epoxy all together. Because a lot of times if you mix it when it's completely flat, the epoxy can kind of spread out more on the cardboard. But again, we just want to make sure we get this mixed together really, really well, so it's going to harden properly in the end. Okay, once we've got the epoxy mixed together, obviously next step is to put it on the board. So basically gonna lift the board up, and with the boards, the separation, we don't wanna make it any more than it already is. So what I like to do is, obviously you can use your razor blade and kind of pry open that gap a little bit. But what I like to do too, because I don't want to have to pry it open too much, is I'll actually take some of the epoxy and I'm going to run it right along that that separation on the board, and I'll try to get a good amount of it all the way along it where it's kind of sitting, oops, let's knock the camera over, where it's sitting right on top. And then we'll go ahead and pry it open. And the reason I like to do this is when you hold the board up on its side like this, you can kind of let gravity do its work. So once you get a good amount of epoxy just right along the whole thing, kind of sitting on top of that separation, now what we can do is we can take an old razor blade and we can actually use that to kind of open the gap up a little bit. And I like to kind of run it down the down that gap and kind of just pry it just a little bit, just open it a little bit here and there. And that way, as you're opening it, the epoxy is wanting to kind of fall down into that gap. And then once we kind of run it along the entire thing, now what we can do is kind of stick the razor blade and kind of push the epoxy into it a little bit more and try to go down that whole thing. And the nice thing about this razor blade is that it's very, very thin. So when we're sticking it down in that gap, we're not separating and prying that gap open too wide and making it worse, because we want to make sure we can get that epoxy as far down into that gap as we can. And obviously once we clamp this thing down, that's going to help squeeze the epoxy down and push it into those gaps a little bit more. But again, the more we can get down there right off the bat, the better. And then from there, we can just kind of clean it up a little bit. I take the razor blade, just kind of run it along the sidewall of the board, along the edge. Just again, getting as much as you can inside that gap, because that's where we want all that epoxy. We don't want it sitting on the edge of the board. And you can basically take your razor blade, and since it has that nice sharp edge, and always be careful with it, but just run it right along the edge, especially on the bottom. We don't want to get any epoxy on our base. And then run it right along the edge on the top there as well, to make sure that we get all that excess epoxy cleaned off of it. So once we've got that done, now comes the easy part, clamping it down. So take your plastic, and again, I like to use plastic that's a little bit thicker, something that comes from maybe a t-shirt or a sweatshirt or some clothing you had shipped to you. One, it's clear, you can see through a little bit better, and two, it's a little thicker than like a bag you get from the grocery store or something. And then from there, we just want to clamp this thing down. Now, I like to go right to the middle, and I like to actually clamp that part down first. And then again, you can use these. I've got these grip clamps where you can just kind of squeeze as hard as you can and get it nice and tight down. Or you can use C-clamps, really any kind of clamp where you can get a lot of pressure on there because you want as much as possible. And then this one, since it is a little bit, longer, we kind of, separation on this one was probably closer to like a 4-inch, kind of opening. Get that clamp down. And then if you don't have a ton of clamps too, you can always use like a flat piece of metal, or even like some pieces of wood, like some little 2x4s and stuff too. That can basically help spread that pressure out and get it a little bit more evenly. Obviously I've got the luxury of having enough clamps here to really cover that whole thing. And again, we're just gonna get this thing as tight as we can. All right, once you've got that clamp down, you can leave the boards, if you can have the board sitting upright, there's nothing wrong with that. One thing that I always do too is if I'm gonna set it down, I will always set it base up. Clamp it so you can set it base up, because if there's any of that excess epoxy that kind of squeezed out of the hole, we don't want it going down onto the base. We want it going the opposite way. All right, now that we got that thing clamped down, we just have to wait. So, basically, just kind of follow the instructions on the epoxy. Most of them will set up and they say 5 to 10 minutes, but they're not fully strong until around 12 to 24 hours. So I like to make sure that it's 24 hours just to make sure that epoxy is as hard as possible. All right, it's been a little over 24 hours now, so the epoxy should be completely hardened and set. So we're gonna go ahead and pop the clamps up. Peel off the plastic and we're gonna check it out. It looks like it is definitely sealed up. We've got a little bit of the excess epoxy on there. Next step from there is literally just to clean it up. So you can take a knife, depending on how hard the epoxy is, and just kind of run it along the side, just to kind of, again, clean up that excess epoxy and kind of get it off of there. If you've got any on the base too, we want to try to clean that off as well because the epoxy is not the same as your base material. So you want to make sure that you get that nice and clean as well. And the other thing that you can use too is if you're finding that maybe the epoxy is a little too hard, or it's still kind of rough on there and you want to smooth it out. The other thing that you can do too is basically take a piece of like a fine grit sandpaper. This one is a 2000, and just give it a little bit of a sand, just to kind of smooth that out. And then after you're all done smoothing out the sides of the board, again, it's never going to be just as pretty as the day you bought it, but it actually will be pretty close. And then once you get from there, re-wax your board, sharpen up those edges just to make sure that everything is nice and clean and your board is nice and fast and ready to go for the next day. All right, well, thanks for checking out our video on how to fix the sides and the sidewall of your snowboard. And again, if there's any damage beyond what we have here, if the bottom of the base is really bubbled up and you get a really big dent, or if your edge is cracked, definitely take it to a local ski shop with a certified tech who can, fix that properly. But again, if it's just little separations and things like we showed in here, it's something that is easy to do yourself. Your board may not look as pretty as it was day one, but it's gonna ride just as good as it did day one. Another thing too, just to make sure if you're not super confident with your fix, just make sure after every day that you check on it and just check those little spots and make sure that they're not opening up, and that the glue did actually get down in there. And again, just try it again. But again, if you're not feeling confident, 100% want to take it to that local ski tech to make sure that they can fix it properly for you. But if you got any questions beyond anything we talked about in the video, leave some comments down below. We're on there every single day trying to answer your questions. We want to make sure we get you into some rad gear, but we also want to make sure that it can last you a long time, and when it gets damaged, you can fix it too. But like, subscribe, definitely make sure to get that notification bell on too, so you can find out when all the new videos drop. And yeah, if you got a crack in the side of your board, you got a little bit of separation, get that thing glued back and get out and ride, because any day of riding is a good day of riding.